The call came just after midnight on a quiet Tuesday in March 1991. Inside a modest U.S. Coast Guard communications room on the Florida coast. The night shift was running as it always did. Half-empty coffee cups, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the gentle hiss of static from the radios. Then, without warning, a sharp crackle cut through the room. It began as faint noise, like a voice speaking through water, before words began to surface. "This is Lieutenant Charles Taylor. Flight 19. Mayday." Mayday. The petty officer on duty froze. The name was familiar, almost too familiar, but he couldn't immediately place why. The voice was deep, steady, with the clipped precision of military training. Yet there was something strange about the tone. Measured, almost resigned, as though the speaker already knew rescue wouldn't come. "We can't see land. Everything is wrong. Compass is spinning." The signal was weak but distinct, drifting in and out like an old record with a scratch. The operator glanced at his equipment, expecting to see the call sign of a small aircraft in distress. But the system displayed something impossible. No transponder data, no identifying frequency origin, just an untagged carrier wave bleeding into the standard emergency band. When the voice repeated his name and coordinates, the operator wrote them down. But that's when the chill set in. The coordinates placed the source deep within the Bermuda Triangle, an area that, on that night, was calm and cloudless. And the name Charles Taylor suddenly rang like a warning bell in his mind. Taylor was no ordinary pilot. His name was etched into one of the most infamous aviation disappearances in U.S. history. He had been the flight leader of Flight 19, a squadron of 5 Navy Avenger torpedo bombers that vanished without a trace in December 1945 during a routine training mission over the Atlantic. Official searches had found no wreckage, no oil slick, no bodies, nothing. The Navy's report had concluded that Taylor and his men were lost at sea under unknown circumstances. And yet, here was his voice, 46 years later, calling for help. The petty officer's training told him to respond, to follow protocol. "Flight 19, this is United States Coast Guard Station Lauderdale. Do you copy?" Silence. Then the voice again, but slightly different this time. "Fuel is low. Visibility 0. Tell my mother." The rest was drowned in static. The operator hit the record function on the radio log system. But before he could complete the entry, the transmission ended with a sharp, unnatural pop. The kind of sound radio men describe as a dead air collapse. The frequency fell silent, as if it had never existed. Within minutes, technicians were in the room, replaying the captured audio. The voice was grainy but clear enough to match with historical recordings of Taylor's pre-flight briefings from 1945. The timbre, inflection, even the breathing patterns were eerily identical. One technician muttered under his breath, "It's him." But there was a problem, several in fact. First, the frequency the call came through wasn't in use in 1945. It hadn't even been allocated for aviation distress signals until the late 1960s. Second, the audio had no traceable source point. In modern radio detection, a signal's origin can almost always be triangulated, unless it's being rebroadcast from a moving relay or from somewhere outside conventional mapping. Third, and most unsettling, when the operator cross-checked the coordinates with radar and satellite data for that hour, no aircraft, civilian or military, was recorded anywhere within 200 miles of that spot. By 2 a.m., the recording was marked classified and sealed in the base's restricted archive. But before it was locked away, One copy was sent to a Pentagon liaison with a note that read, "Unexplained anomaly. Possible connection to 1945 disappearance. Recommend immediate review." For the men in that room, the night ended with unanswered questions and an uneasy sense that they had brushed against something that didn't belong in their timeline. But for the historian who would later stumble across a heavily redacted mention of the incident, it was the first thread in a far stranger tapestry, one in which voices could outlast bodies, and a pilot lost to history might still be circling somewhere in the shifting fog between years. In the weeks following that strange night in 1991, the incident at the Florida Coast Guard station became a ghost story told only in low voices among the night shift. Officially, the matter had been handled. The recording was reviewed. The case file was closed, and the event was relegated to the background noise of military life. But for the men who had been there, it didn't feel closed. It felt buried. At first, there was at least a paper trail. The standard procedure had been followed. Date and time stamped, a brief description of the event, the audio file attached to the report. But within a month, something peculiar happened. The printed radio logs from that night, both the original and the carbon copy, were gone. Not misplaced, not refiled. Gone. The digital log, stored in the base's secure mainframe, was also missing its entry for March 12, 1991, between 00:02 and 00:20 hours. The file block itself still existed, an empty container where the data should have been. But the contents had been wiped clean. The base's IT officer called it a deliberate overwrite, not an accident. When the petty officer who had taken the call asked his supervisor about it, he was told curtly, "The matter has been reassigned to higher authority. Forget it." But forgetting wasn't so easy. A week later, he received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, and unsettlingly well-informed. The caller asked for confirmation of the exact words the voice on the radio had spoken. Every detail, every hesitation, every pause. When the petty officer hesitated, the caller added something odd. "You should know, this is not the first time his voice has come back." The statement lodged in the man's mind like a splinter. Not the first time. Word of the incident leaked in the way such things often do, through fragments of conversation, through someone who heard from a guy in another branch. That's when a ham radio operator from Georgia came forward. He claimed to have intercepted a nearly identical transmission in 1977 while scanning the upper end of the civilian aircraft band. He had written down the pilot's words in a notebook, an old-fashioned habit of hobbyists. And the phrasing matched almost exactly with what the petty officer remembered. This began to form a troubling picture. Multiple instances, decades apart, of the same man, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, calling for help from somewhere inside the Bermuda Triangle, always in the same measured tone, always with coordinates that led to open water. But as quickly as the whispers spread, they began to die out. The few who persisted in asking questions found themselves reassigned, their inquiries ignored. The 1991 recording, once thought to be the most significant piece of evidence, was now said to be misfiled. Then came the most suspicious detail of all. One of the base technicians, frustrated by the lack of transparency, quietly checked the National Military Archives for a backup copy. All radio transmissions from the Florida Coast Guard were supposed to be backed up on quarterly reels stored in a climate-controlled facility. He found the reel for the first quarter of 1991. It was intact, except for a clean, precise splice. Exactly 12 minutes of tape were missing. When asked about the gap, the archivist simply said, "You wouldn't believe how often that happens in this line of work." And yet, the absence of proof only seemed to make the voice stronger in the imagination of those who had heard it. The more official channels tried to erase it, the more it became something else. Not just an unexplained transmission, but a kind of living myth. Some began to wonder if the voice wasn't from here and now, if it belonged to a man lost in 1945, then where was it coming from? And more disturbingly, when was it coming from? The Bermuda Triangle had long been a stage for such riddles. Ships and planes that vanished without wreckage, compasses spinning without cause, weather that defied prediction. But this was different. A voice, human, specific, personal, had pierced the decades and landed in the present. That wasn't just a disappearance. That was communication. It was the absence of the logs, the silence in the official record that told the loudest story. Something, somewhere, didn't want the world to hear him. On December 5th, 1945, the Florida coast woke to a mild winter morning. The air was crisp but calm, the Atlantic smooth under a pale sun. At Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers were prepped for a standard navigation and bombing training run. The mission was routine. Flight 19, a 2-hour triangular route east over the ocean, north over the Bahamas, then back west to base. Leading the squadron was Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, an experienced pilot and instructor with more than 2,500 flight hours. His job was simple: guide 4 trainee pilots through the course, test their navigation, and return before dusk. The Avengers, each a hulking 3-seater with a crew of 3, were fully fueled, checked, and ready. At 2:10 p.m., the 5 aircraft rolled down the runway in staggered formation. Witnesses recall the metallic glint of the planes catching the sun as they lifted into the blue. The control tower logged their departure, their voices crackling confidently through the radios as they climbed to altitude. For the first hour, nothing was unusual. At 3:45 p.m. BART, however, radio operators noticed a shift in tone from Taylor's transmissions. His voice, normally crisp and certain, carried a hint of confusion. He reported that both his compasses were malfunctioning. North was unreliable, the readings unstable. "We're not sure of our position," he said. "We can't see land. Everything looks strange, even the ocean." Another pilot, identified as FT3, suggested they turn west toward Florida. But Taylor, believing they were over the Florida Keys and therefore had to head northeast to reach base, gave the opposite instruction. This would prove fatal. The 2 compass readings, if either was still working, contradicted each other. The afternoon light was fading, and cloud cover was forming in strange, low sheets. Over the next 40 minutes, their transmissions became erratic. One moment, Taylor's voice was sharp, barking orders. The next, it sounded distant, muffled by static. Operators at Fort Lauderdale and Miami stations tried to triangulate their location, but the bearings refused to lock. Sometimes they pointed toward the Bahamas, sometimes toward open Atlantic, sometimes nowhere consistent at all. At 5 p.m., a new voice broke in. "We can't hold altitude. Fuel running low." The weather had worsened. A sudden squall appeared on radar, moving faster than typical for the region. Rain pelted their canopies, and visibility dropped to near zero. The last coherent words from Taylor came at 6:20 p.m. "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." His voice was firm, but beneath it, there was something, an edge of resignation. After that, nothing but static. At 7:27 p.m., the Navy launched a massive search and rescue effort. By nightfall, more than 300 boats and aircraft were combing the area. The USS Solomon's aircraft carrier, destroyers, and even blimps were deployed. But no oil slick, no debris, no bodies were ever found. Adding to the mystery, one of the rescue planes, a PBM Mariner with 13 crew, exploded in midair during the search, its fiery remains plunging into the sea. The official cause was unknown. The loss of the rescue craft was quietly folded into the larger tragedy of Flight 19. The Navy's final report was frustratingly inconclusive. The wording, "lost at sea under unknown circumstances," left room for speculation. Some believed they had simply gotten lost, run out of fuel, and crashed into deep water. But pilots familiar with the route doubted this. Even without compasses, the sun's position and the Florida coastline should have been enough to find home. Others whispered of stranger possibilities: magnetic anomalies, sudden weather walls, or even time pockets in which Flight 19 might have slipped, neither here nor gone, just elsewhere. Whatever the truth, the fact remained. 5 planes, 14 men, and every trace of them had vanished. And yet, in 1991, a voice claiming to be Taylor's had returned. Unchanged, unaged, and speaking as though still in that December afternoon, lost in the same invisible maze over the Atlantic. For those who knew the details, the idea was terrifying. Not that Flight 19 had perished, but that it might still be out there, flying endless loops in a sky no longer aligned with ours. The 1991 incident was strange enough. But in the months after the Coast Guard received that untraceable distress call, other accounts began to surface. Stories that seemed, at first, like radio folklore, until the details began lining up too closely to dismiss. It began with a ham radio operator from Jacksonville, a man who had been scanning high-frequency aviation bands since the 1960s. He claimed he had first heard the Bermuda voice in 1984, 7 years before the Coast Guard transmission. At the time, he was tuning into a narrow frequency used for maritime weather updates, when a sudden burst of static gave way to a man's voice. The transmission was faint but urgent. "This is Lieutenant Charles Taylor, United States Navy, Flight 19. We can't see land." The phrasing was eerily close to the 1945 transcript known from Navy archives. The operator had assumed it was some kind of reenactment or prank, until the voice began rattling off coordinates that, when plotted, landed deep in the heart of the Bermuda Triangle. Over the years, more accounts trickled in. Amateur operators from as far north as Nova Scotia reported brief, unlogged bursts of a male voice matching the same description. Calm, precise, with that clipped military cadence. One ham operator in the Bahamas swore that the voice would sometimes break into local fishing channels, broadcasting for less than a minute before vanishing. The strangest report came from a shortwave listener in Puerto Rico. In 1990, just a year before the Coast Guard's call, he had been scanning during a tropical storm when a voice broke through in perfect clarity. No static, no weather interference. The man identified himself as Taylor and spoke as though describing conditions in real time. Low visibility, erratic instruments, the squadron circling to conserve fuel. Then came a line that made the hair stand up on the listener's arms. Tell them we can see the sun on both sides. Radio experts scoffed. They said such an image was physically impossible, a trick of the mind under stress. But those who have studied the triangle's lore note that similar phrases appear in other accounts of strange events in the area. Sailors claiming to see dawn and sunset at once, or pilots reporting multiple horizons. What unsettled technicians most was the technical profile of these broadcasts. Under normal circumstances, a voice transmission leaves a trace. Its source can be triangulated using multiple listening stations. But in these cases, whenever anyone attempted to lock on to the origin, the signal collapsed into static as if yanked away. It wasn't fading. It was vanishing. For intelligence analysts, there was one deeply uncomfortable possibility: that these were not hoaxes or rebroadcasts, but actual real-time transmissions from 1945, somehow refracted or bent through a kind of atmospheric or electromagnetic anomaly. In simpler terms, the voice could be bleeding into the present from another point in time. The problem was that such an explanation straddled the line between physics and science fiction. Electromagnetic wave propagation can bend signals over great distances, yes. Under certain rare conditions, upper atmosphere phenomena can cause skip effects, allowing a signal to bounce thousands of miles. But to bend a signal across decades? No one had ever documented such a thing in any controlled study. And yet, there it was, the same voice, the same name, the same distress call, again and again. Some skeptics argued that this was nothing more than a case of coordinated hoaxes among hobbyists. But those who had actually heard the voice, especially trained military radio men, said otherwise. There was something about the tone, its steadiness under duress, its cadence, that felt authentic. One retired Navy operator put it bluntly: "You can fake words, but you can't fake that." That's a man who believes he's still in the fight. The Coast Guard operator from 1991 would later admit, in a rare, unguarded moment, that hearing the phantom voice had left him with a quiet dread. Not because it sounded like a ghost, but because it didn't. It sounded alive. And if Taylor was still alive somewhere, then somewhere must not be where or when we think it is. When the Coast Guard operator in 1991 first scribbled down the coordinates Lieutenant Taylor had given over the radio, he expected them to plot somewhere in open water. That much was obvious. But what startled him, and later, those who quietly investigated, was where they didn't lead. On the chart, the numbers fell inside a rough triangle formed by Miami, Puerto Rico, and Bermuda. The exact point was roughly 220 miles northeast of Nassau, far from any major shipping lane, too shallow for transatlantic passage and too deep for casual fishing trawlers. The nearest landform on standard maritime charts was nothing more than a note: unverified shoal, depth uncertain. In the days that followed the incident, an analyst at the Naval Oceanographic Office ran the coordinates through their bathymetric mapping system, a 3D scan of the ocean floor, built from decades of sonar surveys. What came back was strange. Beneath nearly 3,000 feet of water, the seafloor in that region was unusually flat, like a tabletop. But rising from it, in faint relief, was something that did not look like a natural formation. It was angular, with edges that formed a rough square almost 400 feet across. It had a central mound, surrounded by what appeared to be 4 symmetrical ridges radiating outward. The analyst thought it resembled the base of a structure, perhaps a seamount that had been sheared flat, or a coral formation built on some long-submerged rock. But its proportions were unnervingly precise. Too precise. He sent the images to a civilian marine geologist under the pretense of a training exercise. The reply came back 2 days later. "If I didn't know better, I'd call this man-made." Curiosity took over. In May 1991, a privately funded dive expedition out of Nassau attempted to reach the site. Using side-scan sonar, they confirmed the presence of a raised structure about 60 feet high with right-angled edges. But the current was fierce and the water too deep for standard scuba. They dropped a remotely operated vehicle equipped with a camera. The footage was murky, the lights scattering in the silt-choked water. For a moment, it seemed like nothing but coral and stone. Then, as the ROV drifted closer, the beam illuminated a section of the ridge. Carved into the rock were parallel grooves, 3 evenly spaced lines, each about an inch deep, running perfectly straight for several feet, before vanishing under encrusting sea life. Natural erosion? Possibly. But the grooves had an odd uniformity that suggested tools, not tides. And then came the most puzzling detail. Just beyond the mound, the sonar picked up what appeared to be metallic debris, thin, curved fragments partially buried in sediment. The dive team retrieved one piece, no larger than a dinner plate, covered in corrosion, but still metallic to the core. Metallurgical analysis suggested an alloy consistent with mid-20th century aviation materials, aluminum mixed with trace elements used in military aircraft skins during World War II. But here was the problem. According to Navy loss records, no plane, civilian or military, had ever been reported down at those coordinates. Not in 1945. Not in any year. When the team returned for a second dive in June, they found the debris gone. The grooves were still there, but the metallic fragments had vanished, as though the site had been swept clean. The currents were strong in the region, but not strong enough to move metal buried in silt. The coordinates that Taylor had broadcast, whether in 1945 or in his phantom 1991 transmission, now pointed to a location that seemed to hold both the impossible and the inexplicable. A submerged, angular structure in one of the most enigmatic stretches of ocean on Earth. And yet, if this was where he had been circling, it posed a question as unsettling as any disappearance. Was this a crash site or a destination? In October of 1991, 4 months after the initial dive team's puzzling discovery, a joint U.S. Bahamian expedition was quietly organized under the guise of marine geological research. On board the Sea Lark, a retrofitted survey vessel, were oceanographers, naval observers, and a small team of deep-sea divers with clearance to handle potential military salvage. Their target was the same set of coordinates Lieutenant Taylor had transmitted, the point now infamous among a small circle of investigators as Grid Echo 9. When the Sea Lark reached the site, conditions were unexpectedly perfect. Calm seas, low wind, visibility that stretched to the horizon. Using an advanced ROV, the crew lowered into the blue. As the camera descended, the waters shifted from brilliant turquoise to a deep, otherworldly cobalt. The outline of the seafloor came into view, and there it was, just as the earlier dive team had described, a raised platform-like formation with ridges radiating outward. But this time, there was something else. The ROV's spotlight swept across an object resting awkwardly against the slope of the structure. A tangle of twisted metal, its frame partially intact. The shape was hard to read at first, obscured by coral growth and sediment. Then the camera tilted, catching a fragment of wing's surface. The crew in the control room went silent. The shape of the leading edge, the rivet pattern. It matched the Grumman WWII Avenger, the very aircraft flown by Taylor and his squadron in 1945. The divers suited up. When they reached the wreck, the details came into sharper relief. The fuselage was remarkably well preserved for something that should have been resting here for nearly half a century. The paint had long since faded, but under the incrustations, a faint number was visible, FT-28, the tail number of Taylor's own aircraft. But the strangest detail wasn't its presence, it was its condition. The metal was corroded, yes, but in a way that suggested years, not decades, underwater. Hydraulic lines were still flexible. Some gauges inside the cockpit, though waterlogged, were unbroken. Even the rubber of the control yoke's grip was intact. Marine biologists on the team whispered about the impossibility of it. Saltwater is merciless. 46 years should have reduced the plane to a skeletal frame. Instead, it looked as if it had gone down. Maybe 10 years ago. Maybe less. And there was more. Inside the cockpit, one of the divers found the pilot's seat harness still latched. But there was no body. No skeletal remains. The seat was empty. They bagged a few artifacts: a corroded altimeter, a segment of control panel, a small leather-bound notebook from the cockpit map pocket. The notebook was ruined, its pages fused together, save for a single loose sheet tucked inside the cover. On it, scrawled in pencil, were numbers, coordinates. Not the ones where the wreck was found. These were different. When plotted, they landed some 40 miles southeast, right in the middle of another unexplored stretch of the triangle. The crew brought the wreck's location and artifacts back to Nassau. Within days, the information was classified. The official report submitted to both governments claimed the wreck was a misidentified civilian aircraft and unrelated to any known missing military flight. The coordinates were scrubbed from the public record, but the divers knew what they had seen. The name, the plane, the impossible preservation. All of it pointed to something that didn't make sense. The only conclusion that fit the evidence was also the most disturbing. The wreck hadn't been there all along. It had arrived. Recently. Which begged a question even harder to answer. From where? The preservation of Taylor's Avenger was troubling enough. But what kept the investigators awake at night wasn't just the wreck. It was the weather. During the analysis phase back in Nassau, the Joint Expedition's meteorological consultant, Dr. Howard Keats, began comparing the known weather data from the day Flight 19 vanished, December 5, 1945, with more recent anomalies over the same coordinates. He wasn't expecting much. The Bermuda Triangle, after all, is notorious for sudden squalls and shifting fronts. Finding similar patterns decades apart shouldn't have been unusual. And yet, that's exactly what made his findings so unsettling. On the Navy's archived radar charts, the storm cell that formed during Flight 19's disappearance had an odd shape, an elongated oval, rotating counterclockwise, with sharply defined edges like a hole punched in the atmosphere. It was small, only about 40 miles across, but intense, and it had moved far faster than typical for the region. Keats cross-referenced this with later data from NOAA's satellite records. What he found was a near-identical storm signature, same size, same shape, same rotation, recorded not once, but 7 times since 1945, always in roughly the same location. always lasting just under an hour before vanishing completely. And here's the part that defied probability. The most recent occurrence had been logged on March 12, 1991. The very night Taylor's voice was heard by the Coast Guard. To Keats, this was no coincidence. Atmospheric patterns can repeat, yes, but this was too precise. The odds of the same compact storm cell forming in the same place with the same movement multiple times over decades. Astronomical. Some in the team began to wonder if this wasn't a storm in the traditional sense at all, but rather something else. In aviation lore, there are accounts of electronic fog, dense, fast-moving clouds capable of disrupting navigation instruments, radios, and even visual perception. Pilots have described flying into these mists only to emerge hours or hundreds of miles from where they should be, with little or no fuel missing. Skeptics call these distortions stress-induced illusions. But in the Bermuda Triangle, the stories are too numerous to ignore. If the 1945 storm cell had been such a phenomenon, then its reappearance in 1991 might explain the untraceable voice. It could also explain why Taylor's aircraft seemed to defy normal corrosion, why it appeared decades late, and why it carried fresh coordinates as if no time had passed inside that fog at all. The idea was maddening. What if the storm wasn't weather, but a kind of temporal loop, a moving doorway that occasionally opened in the same patch of sky and sea? And what if Flight 19 had entered that doorway, only to emerge piecemeal across decades, each time brushing against our reality just long enough to be heard, seen, or found, before slipping back out? Keats never wrote these speculations in his official report, but he kept the data. In his private notes, later obtained by a journalist, he underlined one chilling observation: the storm is on a schedule. Whatever it is, it will be back. The next predicted occurrence, according to his calculations, would fall in late 2018. No one on the team would be there to witness it, at least not officially. But when that date finally arrived, the storm did return. And so did the voice. The leather-bound notebook recovered from Taylor's Avenger was a sodden, salt-stiffened ruin. Most of its pages were fused together into a pulpy block, impossible to separate without destroying them. But a handful of sheets, buried toward the center and protected by the way the leather had folded, were still legible. The handwriting was steady, blocky, military neatness even in the cramped confines of a cockpit. The earliest visible entry was dated November 17, 1945, less than 3 weeks before Flight 19 vanished. It began with standard notes, fuel consumption tests, squadron drills, weather observations. But as the days passed, the content began to shift. On November 29th, Taylor had written, "Test flight over sector southeast of Bimini. Unusual interference on compass. Spinning without cause. Also radio distortion. Heard voices, indistinct. Could be cross signal from civilian craft." One phrase repeated, "Keep heading." The entry was underlined twice. A few days later, another note. Cloud formation, unlike any seen before. Sky was clear, then sudden wall of haze, dense, gray-white, horizon to horizon. Instruments wavered. Flew through for approximately 8 minutes. Felt longer. Upon clearing, position seemed wrong. Sun lower than expected. Time lost. Need to check with tower logs. On the day before the mission, December 4th, 1945, he recorded something even stranger. Pre-flight check. Engine sound normal, but felt vibration in frame during taxi. Same echo on radio as last week, like 2 channels overlapping. This time, One voice clearer. American accent, older male, said, "Not yet." Repeated twice. And then the final legible note, dated simply 5th December, 1945. The writing here was hurried, cramped as if written during pauses in conversation or between radio calls. Lost visual contact with trainees for 3 minutes. Then they reappeared. Ocean color wrong. Luminous bands in water, running parallel, moving faster than current. Thinking about that haze again. If it appears, we'll investigate. Need to know what it is. Then, at the bottom of the page, in a line that was nearly smudged away. Feels like we've done this before. Marine archivists who examined the book agreed it was authentic to the period. The paper, ink, and leather all dated to the mid-1940s. But one materials analyst raised a disturbing point. The preservation of the inner pages didn't match normal seawater damage. The salt crystallization patterns suggested the diary had not been submerged for decades, but for perhaps a few years at most. If that was true, then either the diary had been replaced, or it had been somewhere else for most of the intervening time. Somewhere that wasn't subject to normal decay. The diary was quietly removed from the expedition's official manifest and stored in an unmarked container. When a journalist who had been following the Bermuda Triangle file requested access years later, she was told there was no record of such an artifact being recovered. But those who had read it never forgot the last 2 lines. They didn't sound like the words of a man about to vanish. They sounded like the words of someone who knew he already had. In the months after the diary surfaced, naval historians and aviation experts combed through the official after-action reports of December 5th, 1945, searching for any overlooked clue. On paper, the timeline of Flight 19 seemed straightforward. Departure at 2:10 p.m., last contact at 6:20 p.m., presumed ditching shortly thereafter. But as one researcher, Lieutenant Commander Alan Reese, retired, began cross-referencing the tower logs from Fort Lauderdale, Miami, and the Bahamas stations, he noticed something strange. Something that shouldn't have been possible in such meticulous military record-keeping. Between 3:41 p.m. and 3:54 p.m., there was nothing. No transmissions, no weather updates, no logged navigation corrections, 13 minutes of absolute silence from 5 aircraft on a training mission, a blackout that appeared in every copy of the logs, as though the time simply hadn't happened. Normally, radio silence this long would trigger a procedural escalation, calls to the squadron, alternate frequencies, even flare deployment. But none of the logs recorded any such measures. It was as if no one noticed the gap in real time. Reese brought this anomaly to a former Navy flight controller who had been stationed at Fort Lauderdale in the 1950s. The man studied the log sheets for a long time before saying, "We used to call that dead air." Not silence, just nothing to hear. Like the air itself wasn't carrying sound. More troubling was what Reese found in a peripheral document, a fuel usage estimate prepared after the disappearance. Based on the Avenger's standard consumption rates, the recorded flight time before the last contact should have burned roughly 2/3 of their fuel. But the logbook calculations indicated they'd burned less. In fact, the fuel loss was consistent with a flight that was 13 minutes shorter than recorded. In other words, the planes had traveled through less time than had passed outside. Such an idea was, of course, speculative at best, and career-ending at worst. Reese knew better than to publish anything that hinted at temporal anomalies. Instead, he filed it under navigational inconsistency in the internal report. But privately, he couldn't shake the implication. If Flight 19 had entered the dense haze Taylor described in his diary, could those 13 minutes have been displaced? Could they have been somewhere, or somewhen else entirely, then dropped back into their original flight path without realizing it? When Reese compared the 1945 gap to the 1991 Coast Guard incident, his unease deepened. The voice transmission that night, which lasted only moments in the Florida control room, contained enough speech to fill almost twice that time, if measured against the tape speed. It was as though the recording had been stretched. Echoes of a longer conversation that no one in the room had heard. The more he studied the data, the more a picture formed that was too strange to ignore. Flight 19's disappearance might not have been a single catastrophic event. It could have been the beginning of an ongoing loop. One in which time itself was bending, folding, and occasionally allowing a fragment to slip through. And somewhere inside that loop, Taylor was still flying, still speaking, still calling for a rescue that might never come. The second set of coordinates found in Taylor's cockpit notebook pointed investigators away from the original wreck site, southeast into a quieter, less trafficked part of the Bermuda Triangle. When plotted on maritime charts, the point landed in open ocean, no official landmass within 50 miles. But when analysts overlaid historical maps from the 18th and 19th centuries, something peculiar appeared. On several of those old charts, there was an unassuming speck marked simply as Saint. Brendan's Key, or on some sandy isle. No one knew who had named it or why. Maritime historians noted that the British Admiralty stopped including it on official charts sometime around 1912, after a naval survey ship reported no such feature found. But stories persisted among Bahamian fishermen and inter-island traders. They spoke of a sandbar that would sometimes rise above the water for weeks at a time, supporting birds and even small shrubs, before vanishing entirely beneath the waves. And sometimes, they said, it appeared not where it had been before, but miles away. In early 1992, just months after the wreck discovery, a private reconnaissance flight sponsored by a Marine Research Foundation decided to investigate. The pilot, flying a twin-engine Beechcraft, recorded aerial photographs of a pale, crescent-shaped formation, breaking the surface almost exactly where Taylor's notebook coordinates indicated. By rough estimate, it was about 300 yards long, maybe 50 yards across at its widest point. A sliver of pale sand and scattered rock in the endless blue. But when the team returned just 3 weeks later aboard a research vessel, there was nothing. The GPS locked onto the exact same coordinates, yet the ocean stretched unbroken to the horizon. No shoal, no ripple, just water. Satellite imagery proved no more consistent. In some archived shots, there was a faint smudge of discoloration, lighter blues over what could have been a shallow rise. In others, there was nothing at all. One oceanographer likened it to trying to photograph a ghost. Local lore tied the disappearing island to strange events at sea. Fishermen claimed that compasses would spin when they approached it. Some swore their engines would stall without warning. A few older captains, those who remembered hearing about Flight 19, went further, saying the island was older than the sea and moves when it's called. One story, told by a weathered man on Harbor Island, was particularly unsettling. He claimed that in the late 1960s, while longline fishing, he'd anchored near the sandbar overnight. In the small hours, he awoke to the sound of an engine, low, throaty, steady. When he stepped onto his deck, he saw a shadow pass overhead. The moonlight caught the shape just long enough for him to recognize it. A prop-driven warplane, flying low and slow, without navigation lights. It made no sound but the engine, no wake on the water, no rush of air, before banking away into the dark. In the morning, the island was gone. If the coordinates in Taylor's notebook were leading toward such a place, it raised a disturbing possibility that he knew about it. Perhaps he had seen it before the mission. Perhaps in that last flight, he had been aiming for it. And if the island did not stay on maps, perhaps it did not stay in time either. In 1971, 2 decades before the Coast Guard heard Taylor's voice again, a Bahamian fisherman named Elijah Ward claimed he had seen something no one believed. At the time, Ward was a seasoned hand, running solo in his small wooden sloop between Bimini and Andros, a route he had sailed hundreds of times without incident. It was just past noon, the water calm and flat like poured glass. Ward was drifting at idle, hand-lining for grouper, when a low mechanical hum began to rise from the east. He looked up, expecting to see a commuter seaplane making a routine island hop. Instead, what approached was unlike anything that should have been in those skies. An olive-drab aircraft with the rounded nose and high cockpit canopy of a World War II torpedo bomber. Ward stood frozen as the plane descended to less than 50 feet above the water. It flew with eerie smoothness, trailing no visible exhaust, no wake disturbing the water beneath. The propeller spun, yet the sound of the engine was oddly muted, more like a distant vibration than a roar. The pilot, if there was one, was indistinguishable behind the glare of the canopy glass. Ward swore the plane's wings bore faint white stenciling, though too faded to read clearly. It passed directly overhead, banking slowly toward a stretch of shallows near a small, uncharted sandbar, the very area that matched later with Taylor's notebook coordinates. As Ward watched, the plane seemed to dip its landing gear, not fully down, just enough to skim the water before lifting again. Then came the part he could never explain. In the space of a heartbeat, the air ahead of the plane shimmered like heat above asphalt. The bomber flew into that distortion and was gone. No splash, no arc away into the clouds, simply not there anymore. Ward's account might have been dismissed as a sailor's embellishment had it not been for 2 things. First, the timing. The day before his sighting, a Miami-based ham radio operator had logged a brief, unexplained transmission on the aviation distress frequency. A male voice giving coordinates eerily close to the sandbar. Second, the weather records showed no storms, no haze. Nothing to obscure visibility in that sector at the time. Years later, when Ward was shown photographs of World War II-era Avengers, he pointed immediately to one marked FT-28. "That's her," he said without hesitation. "That's the one I saw." What unnerved researchers who later interviewed him wasn't just the consistency of his story, but his insistence on one small detail. The air around the plane didn't ripple like water. It folded. Ward died in 1994, never recanting his account. But within the small network of Bermuda Triangle investigators, his ghost landing became a key piece of a theory that was forming. A theory that tied disappearing islands, repeating weather patterns, and phantom transmissions into something far stranger. If Ward had truly seen FT-28 skimming the water in 1971, then Taylor's Avenger hadn't been lost in 1945. It had been moving in and out of our reality, touching down, if only briefly, across the decades. And each appearance seemed to circle back toward the same unmarked place, as though it were trying to land, but could never quite finish the descent. By the mid-1990s, the Bermuda Triangle mystery had faded from the headlines, replaced by newer maritime disasters and changing political tides. But in the background, among military radio operators, aviation hobbyists, and a few tenacious researchers, the case of the Taylor voice never truly went cold. One of those researchers, an electrical engineer named Samuel Lorne, began compiling every reported instance of the phantom transmission he could verify. His record spanned decades: 1977, 1984, 1990, the famous 1991 Coast Guard call, and at least 3 others in the early 2000s. Each report shared certain details: same calm, clipped voice, same identification, and always a set of coordinates within the triangle. But there was another, more technical commonality that Lorne found almost impossible to ignore. Every time someone tried to triangulate the source, the signal vanished. Not faded, not distorted, vanished. Standard radio propagation follows rules. A signal bounces, reflects, and can be traced along those pathways to its origin. Even under unusual atmospheric conditions, there's usually a point of origin that can be narrowed down. But with Taylor's transmissions, whenever 2 or more receivers locked on and began the triangulation process, the broadcast collapsed mid-sentence, replaced by a rush of white noise. To Lorne, it was as if the signal itself knew it was being hunted. He wasn't alone. In 2003, a U.S. Air Force communications officer stationed in Puerto Rico privately admitted to Lorne that they had once caught the signal on a classified wideband scan. The voice was clean, free of the usual static, so clean that the automated logging system flagged it as a local transmission, meaning it was supposedly originating within a few miles of the receiver. But when they attempted a ground search, nothing. No aircraft, no boat, no buoy beacon, just open water. The signal had lasted less than 90 seconds before dropping out. There was also the matter of the frequency itself. In 1945, Flight 19 had been operating on military channels that no longer existed. Yet the modern Taylor broadcasts didn't use those old bands. They came through on contemporary aviation distress frequencies, sometimes even bleeding into commercial channels. That suggested one of 2 possibilities, neither comforting. Either the signal was being somehow translated into modern frequencies as it arrived, meaning it was passing through something that altered it, or the voice itself was being generated in real time, in the present, using a frequency chosen with current knowledge. The first possibility hinted at some kind of temporal refraction, a literal bending of radio waves through time. The second implied that Taylor, or whoever was speaking as Taylor, was still alive and transmitting now. Lorne leaned toward the first explanation. But a peculiar detail in the 1991 Coast Guard tape made him pause. In the background of Taylor's voice, barely audible under the static, was a faint clicking pattern. It wasn't random. When slowed down, it matched the spacing of Morse code. But the letters didn't form any standard words. They repeated in a looping sequence, dot, dash, dash, dot, over and over. The sequence didn't correspond to any known distress code. But it did match something else. A navigational beacon pulse pattern used in the Bahamas until the early 1960s. That beacon had been dismantled more than 30 years before the 1991 call. If the signal was modern, how could that pulse be in the background? If it was from 1945, how could it be on a frequency that didn't exist yet? The frequency was becoming less of a communications channel and more of a riddle. a thread that could only be followed so far before it unraveled into silence. And silence, in this case, didn't mean nothing. It meant Taylor had slipped away again. By the time the 2003 signal incident had been quietly filed away, oceanographers had begun looking more seriously at the underwater geography of the Bermuda Triangle. One of them, Dr. Miriam Cortez of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, was less interested in the mythology and more in the mechanics. What physical forces could exist in that part of the Atlantic to produce such a dense record of navigational anomalies? Her research led her to a series of deep-sea current surveys conducted over decades. These weren't surface flows, but powerful rivers of water moving hundreds of feet below, invisible from above. Most ocean currents are predictable, driven by temperature and salinity gradients. But the ones beneath the triangle weren't normal at all. Beneath the coordinates tied to Taylor's wreck, the currents did something strange. They didn't just flow, they spiraled. At a depth of about 2,800 feet, instruments recorded a corkscrew pattern in the water, a massive vertical vortex that turned slowly but with incredible force. At its edges, water was pulled downward. At its center, there was a slow, upward push. These spirals weren't permanent fixtures. They appeared and dissipated in cycles, sometimes vanishing for years before returning almost exactly in the same place. The data hinted at a periodic rhythm, roughly every 26 to 28 years. Cortez was startled to realize that one of these reappearances coincided precisely with December 1945. Another had been logged in 1971. The same year, Elijah Ward claimed to see the ghost landing. And another, of course, in 1991, the year of the Coast Guard transmission. Some fringe theorists seized on the idea that such spirals could act as fluid lenses, bending sound or radio waves in ways that could extend their reach far beyond normal limits, or even distort time itself by creating a localized gravitational anomaly. Cortez didn't endorse such claims outright, but she didn't dismiss them either. We don't know the full effects of sustained rotational currents on space-time at depth, she admitted in a closed symposium, especially not when paired with rapid atmospheric changes above. Divers who had been near the spiral surface described sensations that went beyond normal turbulence. Compass needles drifted lazily, refusing to settle. Watches lost or gained minutes over the course of a dive. Cameras malfunctioned. One salvage diver told Cortez something off the record, that on a clear dive in the mid-1980s, he had looked up toward the sunlight and seen what appeared to be the shadow of a plane, high overhead, moving in slow arcs. Yet no aircraft had been reported in the area that day. If these hidden currents were part of the Bermuda Triangle's deeper mechanism, they might explain why so many disappearances clustered in certain locations and years. But they also raised another possibility, one that matched the strange, looping nature of Taylor's transmissions. What if the currents weren't just carrying wreckage or distorting instruments, but cycling entire moments, pulling them back into the same patch of ocean again and again? In that case, Flight 19 hadn't been lost in the traditional sense at all. It might still be there, trapped in a spiral where days, years, and decades overlap, surfacing only when the currents and weather above aligned just right. And if the pattern held true, the spiral would return again in less than a generation, bringing with it whatever or whoever had been circling inside since 1945. In the autumn of 2018, just as Dr. Keats's old prediction had warned, the weather over the central Bermuda Triangle shifted in an oddly familiar way. A compact oval-shaped storm cell formed without warning, rotating counterclockwise with unnerving precision, holding its shape for just under an hour before dissipating. It was the first time in nearly 3 decades that the signature had reappeared exactly where the record said it would. Most of the world didn't notice. But in a small, scattered network of people, radio operators, retired Navy techs, and the few scientists willing to keep one foot in the fringe, the news lit up like a flare. For them, it wasn't a question of if something would happen during that storm window, but what. It came at 2:14 UTC on the Open Aviation Distress Channel. A sudden burst of static, then a voice, calm and clipped, cutting through as if it had been waiting for the line to clear. "This is Lieutenant Charles Taylor. Flight 19. We have sighted the others. Fuel holding. Visibility poor. Request." The message cut off for half a second, then returned with words that froze the handful of operators who caught it. "I'll tell them not to follow. The loop is closing." And then, as in 1991, the frequency collapsed into a flat, crushing silence. The voice print was later analyzed by an independent acoustics lab in Boston. Comparing it to the surviving 1945 training recordings of Taylor, the lab found a match within a margin of error too small to dismiss. Same cadence, same vocal strain, under stress. But there was something else in the 2018 audio. A second layer beneath the voice, faint but distinct, like another speaker bleeding in. This second voice was unintelligible, distorted by a slow, rhythmic warble that no one could quite clean up. The oddest detail wasn't in the voice, though. It was in the background noise. Amid the hiss, there was a subtle modulation. 3 long beats, 1 short, 3 long again. It wasn't standard Morse code, but it was close. Samuel Lorne, still obsessively tracking the Taylor transmissions, realized it matched the mysterious beacon pulse heard in the 1991 recording. A beacon that, officially, had been dismantled in the early 1960s. When Lorne overlaid the 1991 and 2018 signals, something uncanny emerged. The 2 transmissions were not just similar. They were synchronized. The same background pulses aligned perfectly, as though both messages had been transmitted simultaneously from the same origin point, separated only by the listener's year of reception. This raised a chilling possibility. Taylor wasn't speaking from the past into the present. He might be speaking into both at once. That night, weather satellites recorded a brief spike in electromagnetic activity directly over the storm cell, lasting less than 3 minutes. No civilian flights were reported in the area. The only surface vessel within 100 miles was a Panamanian-flagged freighter, whose captain later claimed his crew's watches all lost exactly 7 minutes during the passage. By morning, the sea was calm again. The storm was gone. The voice was gone. But for those who had heard it, the 2018 message changed everything. The words, "the others," suggested Taylor's squadron might not be alone in whatever space or time they'd been caught in. And "the loop is closing" hinted at something even stranger, that the phenomenon might not repeat forever. If the loop truly was closing, then the next time the signal broke through might also be the last. If the loop did close, there would be no more chances to learn what lay inside. One by one, the people closest to the investigation drifted away. Lorne retired. His files passed to a younger engineer who treated them like an unsolved equation. Dr. Cortez moved on to other oceanographic work, though she still kept a single sonar print of the underwater spiral framed in her study. The old Coast Guard petty officer, who had heard the 1991 call, refused every interview request until his death. And so, the story returned to the sea. The same sea that had swallowed 5 planes and 14 men without a trace. The same sea that sometimes, when the weather bent a certain way, let a fragment slip back through. Late at night, on clear frequencies, a few hobbyists still listen. They know the odds are low, that years can pass without so much as a blip. But they keep the dials tuned, the recorders running. Because if the voice does return, if the loop hasn't yet sealed, there might still be a final message, a clue, or even, impossibly, a call for coordinates that isn't meant to warn, but to invite. And if that happens, someone will answer. Until then, the Bermuda Triangle waits, silent and endless, holding its secret between the pull of its hidden currents and the long memory of the sky above. Somewhere out there, maybe far beyond where our maps can reach, a squadron leader named Charles Taylor is still flying, his compass spinning, his visibility poor, his voice steady as ever. He is still calling for help. And maybe, just maybe, the loop isn't closing after all. Maybe it's just circling back. The last of the recordings, the 2018 transmission, was stored in multiple locations, hidden across both official and unofficial archives. But among those who had followed the Taylor mystery for years, the urgency had shifted. The focus was no longer just on proving the phenomenon was real. It was on what might happen if the loop he spoke of truly closed. For some, closing meant the end of the cycle. No more strange storms, no more phantom transmissions. Whatever had been leaking through from 1945 would finally seal, leaving Taylor, his men, and any others forever locked away in that unreachable pocket of time. For others, the phrase carried a darker weight. In certain physics models, ones often dismissed as speculative, the collapse of a temporal loop doesn't just cut off communication. It releases everything trapped inside back into the moment it was created. In that version, the quiet Atlantic night of December 5th, 1945, would suddenly find itself flooded with decades of stored motion, energy, and matter, all at once. No one knew which was worse. The coordinates in Taylor's diary, the impossible wreck that seemed too new for its age, the disappearing island, the spiraling currents, they all pointed to a geography that wasn't entirely part of our world. A place that sometimes opened just wide enough for a plane to slip through, and sometimes opened again for a voice to escape.